Let's go!
There was one thing I wanted to check out before we, play more of old school Monster Hunter, and it's an IGN video that is highlighting the fall and then rise of Capcom, which is kind of an interesting conversation that we've been talking about for over 10 years. This is just summarized to a certain degree. I wanted to review the video and sort of offer a bit of insight about what was happening in that time frame to a certain degree, because it is a decent conceptual video that is like, hey, you know what? Yeah, Capcom was going through it for a long friggin' time. That period in the mid 2010s was not easy on the company. It was not easy on us as Capcom fans earlier either. And I have a lot of insight because I worked with them a whole bunch. It was literally when I was an up-and-coming full-time content creator. My whole shtick was covering Capcom games. I love Capcom games type of stuff, and they were at their worst. So this IGN video is fascinating to me because it's sort of like a summarization of many of those elements. And I wanted to review it, go over it, see what they say, and offer any other insights if things don't line up in some way. I'm kind of wondering because there's a lot of shit that went down, and I'm curious what they actually cover in it. This is an interesting title. Capcom was on its knees after Resident Evil 6. Oh boy. Captivating.
Why? Why did it attack us?
Captivating. Its knees? Not its elbows?
With Monster Hunter Wilds breaking Steam records and Resident Evil more popular than ever thanks to Village and a handful of stellar remakes, it's almost as if...
Bruh, RE4 sold so good. It sold ridiculously well.
Capcom is incapable of failure. But that wasn't always the case. Less than a decade ago, after a string of critical and commercial flops, Capcom was on its knees.
That's not right. Wait, we already found something weird. It was, hold up, in the bottom left, it says Street Fighter V Capcom 2008. No, that's for 4. Wrong game.
And its audience.
Many of us started feeling that what the fans and players wanted from the series was getting a little bit separate from what we were making.
Capcom was suffering from an identity crisis.
Yeah, that dude, the era after Resident Evil 4 was very weird. RE5 was a very popular game and sold well, but it was clear that the game was going in some crazy ass direction. This was the period of time where it's like Capcom is like, we need our Call of Duty, you know?
Resident Evil, which established the survival horror genre, had lost its bite after Resident Evil 4. Another big hitter, Street Fighter, was on the ropes after the poorly received Street Fighter V. It could have easily been the end of Capcom and its much-loved games. But in the darkness, there was light. A change in the way Capcom made its games, supported by a powerful new game engine, gave these much-loved series a new lease of life and kickstarted years of critical and financial success that catapulted Capcom back into the big league.
Now they're so big, it's crazy, dude. Capcom is bigger than ever before. Was Street Fighter V that bad? Just for perspective, yes. The first year of Street Fighter V almost sank the entirety of the brand. And yeah, some stuff changed internally because I think the people that are currently making Street Fighter 6, Matsumoto-san, Nakayama-san, they were brought on board at some point to fix Street Fighter V. This was a long time ago. In the background, they always just wanted to make 6, you know? So it's clear why Street Fighter 6 feels like a sequel directly to Street Fighter V instead of being an entirely brand new game. Really feels like a Street Fighter V sequel, which is not a bad thing because it's a much better Street Fighter V.
2016 was a bad year for Capcom. The big Resident Evil game released that year was Umbrella Corp, an online co-op shooter that was pummeled by reviewers and fans alike. Meanwhile, Street Fighter V was met by a collective eyebrow raise from longtime fans who could hardly believe this lackluster fighting game was the sequel to the brilliant Street Fighter IV.
$60 game with barely any content at all. Like, there was no arcade mode. The only thing you can do single player was like to fight against a survival mode that unlocked colors. It was insane.
And Dead Rising 4, which featured the long-awaited return of beloved photojournalist Frank West, would end up being the series' final new entry. This was the low ebb of a string of forgettable years Capcom had endured since 2010. The mainline Resident Evil games were met with diminishing critical reception despite strong sales. Street Fighter was on the ropes thanks to a poorly received new entry, and Capcom mainstays like Devil May Cry were nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, the company's most popular and successful franchise at the time, Monster Hunter,
It does great in one region, and that's it.
was huge in Japan, but struggled breaking into international markets.
This is what Monster Hunter was for the longest time. Like, it could just not find a substantial audience anywhere outside of Japan. It just couldn't.
All of this is a far cry from the Capcom we know today, but achieving this success took more than simply learning from past mistakes. Capcom had to rethink its entire strategy, from the types of players it targeted to the technology it used to make such a turnaround possible.
So it was a few factors that came together, the change of the engine, and also all teams were given a very clear goal at that point to make games that reach the global market and are fun for everyone.
Around the time of Street Fighter V's release, Capcom underwent an internal reorganization to prepare for its new generation of games. These would run on the company's brand new RE engine.
Yeah, that is a good point. They became more of a global company instead of a Japanese company, where we're specifically, like, many of our games are designed specifically for like a Japanese audience in some situations. Yeah, a lot of JP devs were sort of like that. It was hard to get them to see outside of the bubble. And that sort of started changing right around Resident Evil 7. RE7 was the big game.
Which replaced the aging MT framework engine. Additionally, there was a new mandate to help Capcom set itself up for the future. Rather than make games for existing territory-specific fans, it would now make them for a much bigger and broader global audience.
And as a note to that, Resident Evil 6 was designed as the game that would be for the US territory. The whole goal of RE6 was that it was to be their Call of Duty competitor, where they wanted to create like a streamlined sort of Call of Duty Resident Evil game. That premise was that we wanted to capture the Western audience because the Western audience at the time was absolutely the biggest. And this was the era of the absolute dominating Call of Duty like franchise. This was the early 2010s. Yes, that was said directly from Capcom executives at the time that we're trying to create a game that rivals Call of Duty type of shit, you know, which is weird.
Capcom was founded in 1979 as a maker of electronic game machines, or
Then we're going
capsule
back.
computers. It
Back.
rose to ascendancy during the 80s and 90s thanks to 2D games like Street Fighter and Mega Man, and then made the all-important jump to 3D with games like Resident Evil. Between 2000 and 2010, Capcom successfully transitioned many of its big golden era franchises into the modern age, a process that gave birth to one of the greatest games of all time, Resident Evil 4. 2005's Resident Evil 4 is considered by many to be a generational high point thanks to its ingenious mix of horror and action. But
RE4 is not even a generational high point. It's like an industry-defining standard from this point forward. We're still, the entirety of Sony's executive branch and the way they execute games for the quote-unquote third-person action game was literally established from RE4.
that mix altered the course of the Resident Evil franchise dramatically. At its core, Resident Evil 4 is a horror game inspired by the likes of Friday the 13th, H.P. Lovecraft, and the works of John Carpenter. But sprinkled between the strands of its horror DNA are tremendously effective moments of Hollywood action cinema. Unfortunately, this ideal balance between horror and action was lost in subsequent games. In 2009's Resident Evil 5, hero Chris Redfield punches a car-sized boulder with his bare fists.
It's a little disconnected.
And infected enemies are gunned down in a car chase sequence that's more fast and furious than frightening. The series was losing its identity, and this was clear to both players and the developers.
What's wrong with it? Nothing. RE5 is a great game, but it's getting very disconnected from what Resident Evil has historically been. And that's like the point they're making.
Overall, throughout the Resident Evil series, we set up different goals, challenges, and things we want to try with each game. But this time, many of us started feeling that what the fans and players wanted from the series was getting a little bit separate from what we were making.
This directional confusion would result in games like 2012's Resident Evil 6, a game that tried to have its cake and eat it too. In order to please both action and horror fans, Resident Evil 6 split the game between 6 playable characters and 3 unique storylines. Each section catered to either horror or action fans, and so never achieved that all-important balance of both genres, which ultimately left nobody truly satisfied. Disgruntled fans shared their disappointment in these new action-packed Resident Evil games online, while the developers continued experimenting with spin-offs that ventured into new territory like online co-op. This downward trend was not exclusive to Capcom's survival horror series, though. Not so long after the release of Resident
Yeah, they
Evil
don't mention the Revelations games, but yeah, both the Revelations games are sort of like that. They're like weird spin-offs, one specifically co-op focused.
4, the company's Street Fighter team was also flying high. Street Fighter 4 was an instant hit thanks to its unique art style and great cast of new and returning characters. It became an immediate hit at fighting game tournaments and in college dorms alike. But like with Resident Evil, Capcom failed to match those highs with a sequel. Compared to its imaginative and full-fledged predecessor, 2016 Street Fighter V was criticized for releasing bare bones with hardly any single-player content, as well as its abysmal online functionality.
Like, this game came out with less functionality and content than an arcade game. Like, actually less. Because even arcade games mostly matchmake through, like, online. There was less features in this than an arcade game at launch. It's legit crazy.
Fans cite a clear lack of polish and a confusing philosophy towards balance that made the overall experience just plain frustrating. But it wasn't just Street Fighter and Resident Evil that were struggling. Almost every key franchise struggled to make a mark. Devil May Cry, the studio's popular heavy metal action game, was seeing diminishing returns to the point where Capcom outsourced the next game in the series, 2013's DMC Devil May Cry, to UK-based studio Ninja Theory.
Oh, that's correct, right? Yeah, Ninja Theory got DMC, but Devil May Cry 4 sold ridiculously well. As I recall, DMC 4 was not a complete game for sure, but it was the best-selling Devil May Cry game at the time. That isn't exactly the reason this happened. There's a good reason why all of a sudden a lot of Capcom games start getting thrown out to a variety of other developers and their franchises that are not being made internally anymore, and now they are at varying levels of quality, I'd say. And this was the Inafune initiative. Ultimately, what likely got him axed from the company, or he left the company on his own terms, like, this was Inafune's idea. It ultimately resulted in the biggest, like, dark period of Capcom ever, where it's like things like DMC happen, albeit a good game. Things like Strider happen, albeit a good game, but a lot of other weird approaches like the Bionic Commando game and many others in that time frame that are like very weird. It wasn't because of a rush of like a panic of, well, we need to do something different with the series. It's stalemating. Lost Planet 3. Yep. No. It was because there was a different initiative in this time frame to fish out all of their IPs to a variety of third-party developers because it was much cheaper.
While it's gone on to become something of a cult title, DMC's fresh take on the series' mythology, redesigned protagonist, and sluggish 30 FPS frame rate was met with vitriol from online fans. Perhaps unsurprisingly, after such a muted reception, the series was shelved until further notice. This slate of misfortunes defines the Capcom of the early to mid-2010s. Key franchises struggled to replicate the successes of the past, while others were put in cold storage.
Yeah.
New games attempting to capture the Western market, like Lost Planet and Asura's Wrath, also failed to land with audiences.
And there's some good ones in there, right? Don't get me wrong. Some of those games ended up being pretty damn decent. It's just, it was a weird choice. Like, all of a sudden, these things are just being put out into the open by developers that don't have experience with this stuff nearly as much.
There was the odd bright spot like Dragon's Dogma, the new dark fantasy RPG from Devil May Cry director Hideaki Itsuno, but for the most part, Capcom's focus was all over the place.
Also, Dragon's Dogma 1 didn't sell great. It sold great eventually when it showed up on PC and other platforms. Eventually, especially when Dark Arisen happened and like kind of word got out. The initial sales of Dragon's Dogma were not particularly good. It was sort of a game that slow burned over time, similar to like Ultimate Marvel 3. But that initial, all I remember hearing is that they spent so much time and so much money on this game and it didn't actually sell that well. But eventually it did. You know, it was on sale, much less the Arisen, Dark Arisen pack came out, like that kind of stuff.
It was clear something needed to change. By the mid-2010s, Capcom had begun to enact a number of strategy-shifting changes that would totally transform the company's fate. Such changes had to begin small, and so the first matter of business was putting out the existing fires.
Dude, Lost Planet 3 multiplayer, what the hell is that?
So Capcom enlisted director Takayuki Nakayama and producer Shuhei Matsumoto to help steer the troubled game towards stability. While neither were there from the ground floor of Street Fighter V's development and therefore can't detail why Street Fighter V was released in the state it was, the duo inherited a game that greatly needed some substantial fixes in order to regain the trust of fans.
These dudes literally turned Street Fighter V into a good game. Right. It took a long goddamn time, like a long time, but no shit, they were not a part of the project at the start, and they were brought on at some point midway through its development. Like, I don't know if it was like a year or two after, and right around, like, you literally feel their influence in season 3. You really feel like Street Fighter V starts to take a pretty substantial turn.
There definitely were some challenges within the production of the game, and that was part of the reason why I was brought into the team. And because we were in a point in development where we couldn't really make any major pivots or shifts, we had to proceed and move forward in the direction we were currently in, which created constraints on what we could and couldn't do.
Those constraints severely limited the scope of what the pair could achieve. And so, rather than transform Street Fighter V into an S-tier game, much of the work Nakayama-san did was fixing the game's most pressing problems and biding his time until work could begin on Street Fighter VI.
We just didn't really have enough time to address some of the problems and challenges we face in Street Fighter V. And so we basically had to wait for those ideas to be brought back for the initial conceptual phases for Street Fighter VI so we could tackle and do things properly for the next title.
All this considered, why did Capcom not just end Street Fighter V's development and begin working right away on a sequel? If it was such a wait around—
No money. To be real, no money. This company was cooked around this time frame. No shit. The only reason Street Fighter V released as bare bones as it did, and I think we can talk about this, it's been nearly 10 years, Capcom would have been cooked. Like, their financial investment period was destroyed. The game launched in fiscal 2015, which means that it was like before the end of like the first few months of 2016. They had to release it. There was no choice. It's the reason why the game doesn't launch with a story mode. That, no kidding, the story mode launches like 4 months later. Like, not that far away. A whole ass big NRS cutscene story mode that's bad. It's not good. But that story mode would have obviously been there at launch and helped out the game significantly for its launch. If you just delayed it a few months, significantly changed a lot of the impressions that people had, even though it was bad. But they couldn't. They literally couldn't. It had to come out. This was also the period of Capcom where there was a lot of rumors of like big Chinese conglomerate companies maybe scooping them up. And some Capcom executives even like teetering that idea that, like, I'm telling you, I made videos about every single one of these goddamn things, like when they went down, that like Capcom might get bought up, like Capcom for sale, like all that lost media.
The developers, couldn't they just start from scratch?
There wasn't any sort of sense of like, okay, let's just end Street Fighter V and focus on Street Fighter VI. It was more like, while we were working on Street Fighter V, we were trying to figure out what we really wanted to do in Street Fighter VI, content-wise, how we wanted to promote the game itself. Basically, we tried different things during the development of Street Fighter V to see if it worked, and then we took the things that did work.
I think it was Tencent, yeah. There was rumors like 10 years ago that Tencent wanted to buy Capcom. It was an
ongoing process that helped us figure out, okay, what it is that we want to do for the next level.
The team treated Street Fighter V as a lab where they could learn from their design mistakes and figure out what to do differently for the sequel. The years-long process required careful consideration of the game's every core aspect, which informs several important changes.
This is why and again, I said it at the beginning of this conversation, and I've said it several times throughout the history of Street Fighter 6. Street Fighter 6 is Street Fighter 5 too. It just is. Like, so many things, like the shimmy aspect, the strike throw aspect, so many close range interactions are very similar to Street Fighter 5, but Street Fighter 6 adds levels of complexity to it with the parry system, drive impact, like all that kind of stuff. But many of like the ways that you engage the opponent is very similar to Street Fighter 5, outside of like now you have a drive rush and all that kind of stuff. Other Street Fighter games are not like that, dude. Like 4 is very different from 3, and 3 is very different from 2, 2 different from Alpha. But yeah, like they're just confirming doing it. That like most of Street Fighter V was just a testing ground for them to eventually make the game they wanted to make.
There were numerous updates, starting with the fundamentals like steady improvements to the netcode and character rebalances, and progressing all the way up to new characters, V-triggers, and even entire new mechanics like V-shift. A new
and here's the thing. The mechanical depth was an issue with Street Fighter V, but the mechanical problems were not what doomed the game. Funky ass online was always an issue with Street Fighter V because at a foundation the game had fucked up netcode and content. The first few years especially, the game was content devoid.
defensive move that provided a brief window of invincibility.
The mechanical stuff is great, but it ultimately wasn't the thing that like brought people, most people back.
At the development of Street Fighter V, we introduced a new system mechanic called V-shift, which was actually something we were planning to incorporate into Street Fighter VI, but we decided to give it a shot in Street Fighter V instead.
There was a much larger goal for all these improvements beyond just elevating the game to an acceptable level, though.
Street Fighter V had an unofficial fix, though, right? But understand why that fix could never apply. That fix completely screwed up an entire demographic of the Street Fighter V audience, which was console players. So people that were playing on their PlayStation 4s were screwed. And if you had the fix and you played PS4 users, the online was ruined. Like it was unplayable for the PlayStation 4 user. In that way, yeah, you could have fixed the problem, but the issue is at a foundational level, you have two systems the game is being designed around, and those fixes would not apply to the other system because of the overhead CPU power that it requires to do that stuff, right? Which is why it works on PC and it will not work on PlayStation 4. You'd have to rework the entire fucking game.
Capcom was on a mission to rediscover the fun. At the end of the day, fighting games should be enjoyable to play, but Street Fighter V had become a somewhat frustrating discipline to master.
We both realize that fighting games are fun, and when you get used to them, it becomes more enjoyable and something you can essentially play forever as long as you have an opponent to play against. However, one of the challenges that we faced with Street Fighter V is that we felt that there wasn't a clear pathway that helped guide players to get to that level where they finally feel like they're having fun and will want to continue playing.
Bro, I just talked about this at like the Evo, the Evo Ask a Pro thing, right? Where somebody was like, how do you get into fighting games, like that general sort of thing? And I tell them that like the game has to be good. The game has to present cool and interesting characters and fun stuff to do with them for you to make the connection to want to eventually go online and beat people up and be competent with that character in some way. Like you need to do that shit. There are so many fighting games that are just arcade games that don't offer that path, that just do not have any way to bridge the player from all of its cool modes that it has here to, hey, online is also here. Other games have been very good at that, like Smash and shit like that in Mortal Kombat, which is why they endured so much success for those years.
So that's why we tried to come up with new ideas and tackle
how much did World Tour help Street Fighter 6? Immensely.
Where they can learn more about the backstory of the different characters.
I think people are still playing World Tour.
They're playing with. And we tried our best to enhance training mode and add character guides and combo trials and just enhance features that will help the player improve their skill level.
Street Fighter had previously tried to be more approachable by lowering the difficulty, but this only served to turn off longtime fans. Instead, Street Fighter VI's approach was to expand the tools available to new players while giving experienced fans everything they already loved about the series. While they could have cut their losses on Street Fighter V and immediately tried to win fans back with a
Again, like Street Fighter V was a game that became much less mechanically dense to allow for a new audience, which just doesn't work in my opinion. You have to expand things, and it didn't really feel like it expanded anything. That's exactly what Street Fighter VI is. Got the same combos as Street Fighter V for the most part. The way the buffer system works, the way like the 2-frame link system that allows you to from one thing to the next, all that kind of shit is identical in Street Fighter VI compared to Street Fighter V. It wasn't like the execution was locked behind 1-frame links in Street Fighter 4. No. It was locked entirely behind their new systems, their new, overarching mechanical systems that are going to be clearly present in the next game.
Nakayama-san and Masahiro-san knew that this would be a shortcut that didn't grow Street Fighter in any meaningful way. But by sticking with Street Fighter V and using it as a testbed for new ideas, 2023's Street Fighter VI was able to launch as one of the most critically acclaimed games in the entire franchise.
Yeah, literally ever. I think it's like the second or third highest reviewed fighting game, next to like Soul Calibur 1.
If we don't challenge ourselves with new things, then we're not going to make progress and we'll become stagnant. And if we try something new and if players don't like it and they say they don't like it, then we'll just build upon that and change that.
While Matsumoto-san and Nakayama-san were able to take the work put into Street Fighter V Arcade Edition and apply the lessons they learned to Street Fighter VI, it was important that Capcom did not repeat these kinds of situations and be forced into having to overhaul games again. a significant shift in strategy was needed that would prevent such a disaster ever happening.
Yeah.
And that's where a couple of vital behind-the-scenes changes came into play.
Monster Hunter's the big one, but to be real, the big shift was Resident Evil 7.
All of Capcom's games from the PS3 and Xbox 360 era went all in on trying to capture an imagined version of the Western games market. The action-heavy Resident Evil 4 was a big hit, true, but the more gun-focused spin-offs like Umbrella Corps, as well as the sci-fi shooter series Lost Planet, were all clearly chasing late 2000s Western gaming trends to no avail. After several years, Capcom realized it needed to create games that could appeal to everyone, not just fans of traditional Western genres.
Again, DMC was like, let's make a Devil May Cry for the West. It was another like initiative game. Our existing audience isn't big enough. Maybe Devil May Cry is just too Japanese, you know? Let's do something that really pushes this like in a Western direction, you know?
I think that we had that clear goal of just focusing and not holding anything back towards making good games that would reach people all over the world. The changes in the organization and the engine, all these elements came together around that time.
No other series embodies this new company goal better than Monster Hunter. While it had its diehard fans in the West, for decades Monster Hunter was much, much bigger in Japan than the rest of the world. The series was never conceived to be something that was only meant to be big in Japan, but there were real-world factors as to why this happened. Firstly, Monster Hunter found tremendous success moving from the PlayStation 2 to the PSP with Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. The handheld gaming market has always been much stronger in Japan than in the West, as seen with the success of not just the PSP, but also Nintendo's DS and more recently the Switch.
Mobile Monster Hunter is so rough.
Handhelds in Japan is rooted in a number of
non-controller Monster Hunter is crazy.
Monster Hunter was that Japanese gamers were able to reliably play with friends thanks to the widespread adoption of mobile consoles.
I just
20
hate
years ago in Japan,
mobile console
having a
feel.
network
I can't
connection
stand
wasn't as easy, and there weren't a huge amount of people playing Monster Hunter online. However, handheld consoles made multiplayer gameplay easy without internet access, and I regard it as a great success that we had players experience the game in this way, which is one of the ways we really wished for them to play and enjoy it, even in that era when online gameplay wasn't easy.
Why are you here?
You can't do this alone!
Monster Hunter, which is built on a core pillar of cooperative play, recognized that this aspect would be best served when friends could quickly jump into hunts together, and there was no better avenue for that at the time than handheld consoles. Thanks to Japan's mobile games market, it meant Monster Hunter was being developed for a local market first, even if it wasn't intentional.
Monster Hunter in this era was literally designed for people on trains in Japan. A lot of like people in Japan have to spend a whole bunch of their life on public transportation. That was literally their target audience, and it was on fire. Like I remember hearing shit about this, like ad hoc hunts on Japanese trains and stuff like that. It was apparently friggin' huge.
This created a loop of sorts. Monster Hunter games would become bestsellers primarily in Japan, and to keep pace with the audience, Capcom would release Japan-only content and host Japan-only special events.
Dude, that still happened in World.
Reinforcing Monster Hunter as a Japan-only brand. But the reality
the Universal Studios Japan armor
fans in the West, and
in Monster Hunter World,
looking from the outside in as Japanese players received exclusive tie-ins and quests.
Yeah, that still happened.
As the Western world improved its internet infrastructure and online play became practically mandatory for most console gamers,
Japan got all the cool stuff.
Sugimoto-san and the team saw an opportunity to launch their most advanced and most globally accessible Monster Hunter game to date. Released in 2018 on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC, Monster Hunter World was a gigantic change for the franchise. Rather than being scoped for small, less capable handheld consoles, it delivered large-scale, AAA console-quality action with souped-up graphics, bigger areas, and of course, bigger monsters.
You gotta say that, like, we're playing GU and we're experiencing some older Monster Hunter games that are really cool, but I'd argue that, like, World and even Wilds are such good introductory Monster Hunter experiences. Like, they're designed to get people into them, almost like Rise was the game that came after, clearly. But it was like, okay, so you experienced that, now check this out. And it's like, whoa, there's a lot of crazy shit in this. This is what the older games were like, whoa, I didn't know that. Like, that's the route that I took. And I think we're seeing a whole bunch of people go through that right now with Wilds. I've watched many videos and seen many impressions of people that did not not like World nearly as much. And guess what they love? They love Wilds. They love that hunts don't take nearly as long. They love that, you know, they don't have to do all this stuff in between the hunting. Some of the stuff that might have had like the identity of Monster Hunter a bit before, but like Wilds does all this shit that really like streamlines a player to get to stuff and the fun stuff as quickly as possible. And you got to admit, they did a pretty good job at that. It's just a little daunting to people when you do that so fast when you have experience with the series.
So starting with World, our approach to the globalization of the series and Monster Hunter in general not only ties into the themes we had going into...
You see that more contrary where people started with Worlds and they don't like Wilds as much? Exactly. No, that's exactly it, where they don't think Wilds is as good as World or something like that. Not like it's bad, but it doesn't like do it for them. I'm even in that boat where I think I like, you know, the combat clearly better, but I like several other things way more in Monster Hunter World personally. And it's not saying the combat is bad. No, the combat is the best it ever has been. Everybody agrees on that. It's just, it isn't a universal upgrade in every single way.
Designing the game,
but if you started with Wilds, dude, you probably love it.
Monster Hunter World was a nod to our desire to appeal to this global audience, this worldwide audience that wanted to dig into and experience Monster Hunter World, or even Monster Hunter the series for the first time. And that doesn't just come with renaming our product, but also realigning ourselves to hit those global standards that people come to expect of titles around the world. So, for example, with the Monster Hunter series up until then, we'd really been releasing the titles in Japan first with a delay in the localization and worldwide release. Also, sometimes the content would be different in the Japan release versus the US or the worldwide release.
It wasn't...
Dude, GU didn't come out for like, how do I hit subtitles? GU did not come out for like, what, 4 years? It took Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate like several years to eventually even come to the West in like 2019 or something like that. It's crazy.
It wasn't just a matter of making sure other regions got Monster Hunter World at the same time as Japan, though it certainly helped. Sugimoto and co. drilled deep to see what
after
other
World.
ways Monster Hunter's formula could be tweaked to broaden its appeal with players from all around the world.
For World, we conducted focus tests across the world, and some of the feedback and opinions that we got during that process really affected how we designed our game systems and impacted how much success we had globally.
One important change that resulted from these playtests was simply showing damage numbers when players hit the monsters.
I'm experiencing damage number-less Monster Hunter right now, and there's something about it that I like. I'm playing Greatsword, mind you. However, so how the hell do you feel like you're having an impact on the monsters when you cannot see damage numbers, right? Good question. And I was like, how the hell do I enjoy this if I don't know if one thing is better than the next? What's going on? The limitations are sometimes like more effective than the execution. The amount of like crazy hit sparks and hit stop and blood and nutty stuff, they have to convey that if your hit was big, where it's like, oh, okay, was your hit impactful? Was this one better than the next? I feel like the level of impact in Monster Hunter GU from a Greatsword perspective has like 10 levels of like, all right, I made an observation. I hit somewhere between like a 1 to 4, wasn't good. And then at other times, oh, I got a big one. That was between a 7 to a 10. Boom, bitch. I feel like I just dropped a bomb on the monster's head or something. So in some ways, I couldn't see how that could be the case. But as you experience the game, you really get like the visual results of this giant attack landing is extremely profound in some of the older games because they have to communicate that without raw data.
Little tweaks here and there to an already successful formula drove Monster Hunter to the greatest heights it had ever
Don't get me
reached.
wrong, I don't mind the
Previous
damage
Monster
numbers.
Hunter
I just want
games had
both.
typically sold around 1.3
I want the visual
to
cues
5
and the
million
damage
copies.
numbers. I want everything.
Monster Hunter World and its 2024
I want an
Monster
option. I
Hunter
think
Rise
options are great.
Both recorded sales greater than 20 million copies. This explosion of player growth didn't happen by accident. Instead of changing the spirit of Monster Hunter to suit Western tastes, Sugimoto-san and the team found ways to open up the series' unique and admittedly obtuse nature to a wider audience without making sacrifices. This approach has continued with the series' latest game, Monster Hunter Wilds.
At its heart, Monster Hunter is an action game, and that sense of accomplishment you get from mastering that action is an important aspect of Monster Hunter. But for newer players, it's really about getting to that point. The steps involved in getting to that sense of accomplishment is what we're trying to strategize for in terms of designing for new players. So with World and Rise, for example, we were taking great care to analyze where players got stuck, what was hard to understand, what they were having trouble with, getting player feedback, and also doing our own kind of research into that.
Oh, dude, he straight admitted it. So He's not directly admitting it, but he's greatly offering examples based on that sentence of why I think Wilds is the way it is. I think they have hard data from the PC player base, the Xbox and PlayStation player base of Monster Hunter Worlds and Monster Hunter Rise genuinely had an impact on what Wilds is as a game. He's admitting it, but not admitting it. And my presumption was, I think they have enough data that they saw a substantial amount of players buy and play their game and they never get to high rank or something like that. Again, Monster Hunter Iceborne, ridiculously good selling, sold about half as much as Monster Hunter World did. So there's already a huge drop off of people that like committed to the higher rank of the game, likely because they just couldn't get there. So that's like normal. Yeah, it's extremely normal to aggregate player data. What I'm saying is what Monster Hunter Wilds is as a game and why it is a more focused single player story experience is specifically because they have enough data that sort of proved that many people just did not get past like low rank, that didn't even get past high rank, didn't reach the end of high rank, like all that kind of stuff, you know? I think that had a substantial impact on Wilds and why Wilds is the way it is. Because Wilds, for the most part, I think they saw like people don't like hunts to be nearly as long. People don't finish the main content of the game. Dude, everything about Wilds wants to get you to finish the story. And then story mode ends and online mode begins practically. Like, it's really different. I'm like, this is bizarre. Why couldn't we just play this all online? It's like they like siphon the players to get you to at least get to the online and be like approachable. What I'm hoping is that as Wilds develops, they understand eventually that your plan worked. This shit worked, right? People are definitely getting into it quicker than they did before. Some fans of the older games might not be as happy, but it's not like the game's bad. I hope that they balance that out by accompanying the existing player base with some unique content that really bumps up either the difficulty or the length of time the monsters are around, all that kind of stuff. Because when do you do that? Like, you don't want to do it at the start because you can drop off your audience. I think it's the best to do it where the game's at right now.
And all that kind of knowledge has impacted how we've implemented new systems into Wilds.
Yeah, there you go. Just straight up saying it.
Monster Hunter had a winning formula. The challenge Capcom faced was finding ways to convince global audiences to give it a shot. But it was not such a straightforward task for every series in the company's portfolio. When it came to Resident Evil, the development team had to decide which of the series' intertwined formula was a winner: gory action or survival horror. Ultimately, it was Resident Evil executive producer Jun Takeuchi who made the call.
The GOAT.
It was around the time I was working on Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2. I was trying to test different things, try different approaches. And around this time is when the R&D teams were divided into R&D Division 1 and 2. The executive producer of the Resident Evil series, Jun Takeuchi, took command of R&D Division 1, and he set the core direction that the Resident Evil series needed to go back to its origins, to its roots.
Takeuchi ruled that Resident Evil must focus on survival horror as its guiding light. This proved to be the right decision. Resident Evil 7 was announced at PlayStation's E3 2016 conference with a moody trailer shot in first person, showing the insides of a dilapidated house. I was there in attendance when the Roman numeral for 7 appeared, followed by the title Resident Evil. The convention hall roared in excitement.
It was so good. It was so good.
There were, of course, questions about how Resident Evil could make the jump to first person. By that point, third-person, over-the-shoulder gunplay had become synonymous with the series.
So chat, just for perspective, Resident Evil 7 was the first Capcom game in almost the entirety of my content creating history up until that point that did not have a severe backlash of some element attached to it, or was just kind of like a mid-game that some people liked and was kind of okay, right? Was a little disappointing. Every Capcom game for the longest period of time had some insane, ridiculous DLC controversy or some wild bullshit for a very long period of time. Even Ultimate Marvel 3 as well. RE7 was the first game to break that mold, where it's like, oh shit, this game's good. Oh shit, it's interesting and provocative and weird and this is great. There was no weird stigma around RE7. Everyone was just excited. So to me, that was like the beginning. This is like the beginning of Capcom finally finding their way again, where it's like, oh shit, this is actually good. And the VR being a big part of it too, you know?
It turns out, however, that in exchange for moving to a first-person perspective, Resident Evil regained something it had lost. It became scary again.
We will never be a family.
Then I don't need you anymore.
With Resident Evil 7, the executive producer, Jun Takeuchi, made it clear that we cannot underestimate how critical it is for the series for it to be scary and about survival. So he
My goat, dude. What a dude.
made it clear that Resident Evil 7 would go back to its origins. It would be very cautious with its survival elements. And with that as a basis, then we would try new and different things.
The game was a hit. While maybe not quite operating on the same level as Resident Evil 4, this significant shift in direction allowed for a welcome return to survival horror. Thanks to its unsettling and claustrophobic Southern Gothic setting, Resident Evil 7 ranks as one of the scariest games in the series. But Capcom wasn't going to abandon the third-person perspective that was so key to the series' DNA. While new mainline titles like Resident Evil 7 and 8 would stay in first person, Capcom planned to release third-person games through a series of brand new remakes, starting with Resident Evil 2. Capcom realized there was a demand for remakes thanks to the appearance of several fan projects at the time.
そうですね、はい。
You might have heard of it, but there were some fans from overseas that were
The
working
Unreal
on their
3
passion
fan mod.
project, doing their own remake for RE2, and
Yeah.
well, it was like, all right, people really want this to happen. So producer Hirabayashi came up with the slogan, well, we'll do it.
Dude. Wait. No.
I'll do it myself.
No. That's the wrong video. My dudes. This was the legendary We Do It video.
どうもレジデントイービルファンの皆さんこんにちは。H ことカプコン第一開発部プロデューサーの平林です。今回レジデントイービル2のリメイクプロジェクト、応援いただき本当にありがとうございます。皆さんの熱い情熱
Again, chat, Jun Takeuchi, RE5 dude, not this guy, but Jun Takeuchi was like, who had that initiative, also is Mr. Lost Planet 2. So that was like his big game. So I'm a big fan of this guy, and the fact that he chose Resident Evil to go back to like these roots means a lot.
応援のおかげで、ようやくこのリメイクプロジェクト開発決定いたしました。
This was how they announced Resident Evil 2 remake.
もう本当言葉通り We do it やりますよ。
So they announced RE2 remake this way. This game would not come out for 4 years, right? This game would not eventually be released until early 2019, something like that. 4 years later, like holy shit, dude.
Result is one of the best games in the entire series. The Resident Evil 2 remake is a perfect blend of horror, combining all the action and puzzles fans have come to expect from the series with a new menacing tyrant system that allows the hulking Mr. X to continuously stalk you throughout the Raccoon City police station. Under Ampo-san's direction, Resident Evil 2 Remake became the second best-selling Resident Evil game in the franchise's history. Naturally, Capcom would follow up its incredible success with a remake of Resident Evil 3, another PlayStation 1 game that could clearly benefit from a modern reinvention. But following that, surely Capcom wouldn't remake Resident Evil 4, a game that still felt
They don't talk about RE3 very much. RE3 tanked? No, it did not. RE3 tanked as much as Resident Evil 6 tanked, and it sold very well. The problem is, critically, it was not great, but it sold very well.
refreshingly modern despite being almost 20 years old. Why touch something many considered to be almost perfect?
I don't want to play it again.
When we put out the remake for Resident Evil 2, we got a very positive reaction. So that made us think, all right, these remakes are something people actually want. And when it came to RE4, as you mentioned, it was still a title that enjoyed some popularity, a very beloved game that people are still playing. So there was a lot of internal discussion on, well, maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe we don't need a remake for Resident Evil 4, especially because Resident Evil 4 is a game that is so beloved.
Yeah.
If we get anything wrong with the remake, people might be quite vocal about their discomfort.
Yeah.
But despite any initial hesitation, the results speak for themselves. Resident Evil 4 Remake was another bona fide hit. Much of its success comes down to the biggest changes, which were focused on fine-tuning the action-horror ratio to achieve Takeuchi-san's goal of keeping the series true to its survival horror roots.
Resident Evil 4 didn't just do well, it's the fastest selling Resident Evil game of all time.
And so gone were some of the original game's campier elements, replaced by a moodier, darker tone that still kept the heart-pounding action hero moments. Around the same time as Resident Evil's rediscovery of its horror core, longtime Devil May Cry director Hideaki Itsuno had a similar epiphany. After a brief sojourn into the RPG world with Dragon's Dogma, Itsuno-san watched as the action genre began to soften in order to appeal to a more casual audience. And so, when the chance to direct Devil May Cry arrived, Itsuno-san saw an opportunity to challenge the audience of a genre he felt was in need of a good kick in the ass. He would do so in spectacular fashion, achieved by leveraging the company's most powerful game engine to date.
その頃に
I feel like the main trend with action games was to make action games that were very kind. Maybe, for me, a little bit too kind to the players, lending a hand to the player too much to my liking.
Itsuno took over director duties on Devil May Cry,
Interesting.
starting with the second game in the series, and has since helmed every new iteration, save for Ninja Theory's DMC. Following the release of Devil May Cry in 2008, it would be almost 11 years before Itsuno directed another Devil May Cry game. But when he did finally return, he would oversee one of the most critically and financially successful games in the entire franchise.
Hell yeah.
If you want it, then you'll have to take it. だが
Dude, Devil May Cry 5 was so substantially big that, like, the relationships of those characters to each other and who Virgil is as a character and all that shit is like common knowledge. Even people that are barely, you know, aware of Capcom games, people like know who Virgil is and shit, you know?
During those 10 years, I was able to accumulate many things that I wanted to do, that I wanted to try. Tell the stories of Nero, tell the stories of Virgil, and also technology-wise, there were not just little improvements that you would have when you work on a series consecutively, because the technology, when there's a wide time frame, changes significantly.
This vision coincided with the launch of Capcom's new RE engine. It's the engine that most of Capcom's games run on today. Replacing the old MT framework that had powered everything from Dead Rising to Monster Hunter World, the major upshot of the RE engine was its handling of photorealistic assets. This gave Capcom's development teams access to higher levels of visual fidelity than ever before. It was also much nimbler than its predecessor, making it easier
Photogrammetry
to implement changes if
what it was
something
really
wasn't
good at.
working as it should.
まず R エンジンのコンセプト
So the original concept for the RE engine was to allow for a development environment that was less stressful and could help us make things quicker. Because it's an internally developed engine, when we needed any additional tools, well, we could ask for them internally. They could be fixed somewhat quickly internally and also iterated on. Whatever tools were implemented, we could see them reflected in the engine pretty quickly. So this allowed us to experiment with trial and error in a much faster way.
This proved vital for Itsuno-san, whose goal was to make the coolest action game of all time. That meant a lot of trial and error to make sure everything from the way the game looked to the way it played was as slick and stylish as possible. The RE engine's combination of rapid development tools and photorealistic capabilities meant Itsuno-san was able to increase the pure style of Devil May Cry by magnitudes.
デビルメイクライシリーズは
Devil May Cry is a franchise that stands on being cool. That's what the franchise is, it's about being cool. Ever since I took over the series from Devil May Cry 3, I put everything that I, as a person, I considered throughout my life to be cool. Anything I've seen on TV, in movies, in comics I've read, any sport experiences I've had, I try to distill everything that I think is cool into what the game is.
Yeah, I don't dislike V that much. I enjoyed playing him from what I played,
Since
but would I want to play him over the other
Capcom has
characters?
released a Game
No.
of the Year contender on a nearly annual basis.
That is a good point. That, like, no shit, since 2017, almost every single year, Capcom has put out a game that could be a Game of the Year contender. Microsoft games have not put out a Game of the Year contender since, like, the mid-2000s, chat. Like, it's not easy. So, just comparatively speaking, like, the company is on that level of, like, rapid-fire success right now. Like, no shit. Like, they are really, really hitting it out of the park at the moment.
Time when major studios are struggling to find consistency, Capcom's winning streak of 10 critically acclaimed games in less than a decade is a major outlier.
Yeah, good point, because we're seeing this happen to other companies like Square Enix right now and even Bandai Namco. The absolute profound success of Capcom in these initiatives have had such an impact on the Japanese gaming industry. We're starting to see the Japanese game industry start to do this stuff. I almost guarantee you that some of these bigger developers are probably going to go start becoming a bit more global in the way they approach their game development. Yeah, I think the Square devs just talked about this too with Final Fantasy VII Remake, how FF7 Remake specifically was a game that they were trying to, like, the series, that they want to create a more global game They want to make a game that's for everybody and not specifically for this one audience. And that lines up exactly with what Capcom is doing, with what Sega is doing right now with a lot of their franchises and shit. And that just makes more sense because like these audiences have existed everywhere. They just want to get more people to play games as much as possible, which is why we're getting more PC games. This doesn't even go over Capcom's PC initiative, which is another thing that has astronomically grown their business over the past like 5+ years.
Focusing on a central goal of creating globally appealing games, all built with a technologically advanced engine capable of powering a multitude of different genres, proved to be a formula for unprecedented success. The Capcom of today is able to elegantly switch from laser-focused fighting games to tight survival horror to sprawling open-world action RPGs without missing a beat. But what's more impressive is that Capcom's mission of making global mainstream games did not dilute its games in the slightest.
The interesting part about that too is that there has been some games that are not that. Kunitsugami, like a really specific, like almost PS2 era game that is extremely like not Western themed, like is specifically Japanese themed, you know? That doesn't really line up with all this stuff, but that's the thing. They're able to take some experiments now. They're at a point where they've made so much goddamn money and they have so much successes that are going to bring stuff in. They're able to release a Kunitsugami and it doesn't sink that development team because that game was well received. It did do well. Was it like a 10, 13 out of 10? No, it was like an 8 out of 10 game by many comparisons, and I played a little bit of it, but it's like the same thing with like Exoprimal and Kunitsugami. They're weird attempts at trying new stuff, but they aren't like, you know, the global initiative stuff. They're actually taking a little bit of chances, which is great. Like that still means that there's chances of like new things emerging, and I'm not just doing Street Fighter, Resident Evil, Monster Hunter to like the end of time or some shit.
Instead, Capcom appears to have found the ultimate balance of keeping its games true to themselves, whether that's the pure survival horror of Resident Evil, competitive spirit of Street Fighter, or the unique battle systems of Monster Hunter, all while expanding the audience for these games by millions. Many of Capcom's contemporaries are now finding themselves where Capcom was just a decade ago, fruitlessly chasing trends and losing sight of their identities.
It's true.
But for Capcom, the changes it made over the past decade has resulted in a new golden age that shows no sign of slowing down.
Yeah, to be real, what's happening to Capcom right now, been a lot of like talk about like Western gaming is going through some pretty rough states right now, but for some reason like the Japanese side of game development is just booming. That isn't every side of Japanese game development. It's a big part of it is Capcom, dude. Like a big part of it is like Capcom selling 8 million copies of a game in the first 24 hours or some shit, or them selling more copies of Resident Evil 4 Remake in a shorter period of time than any Resident Evil game ever. Yeah, there's a reason why Capcom is on the top right now, and it's because the majority of their games are legit super good. They are ridiculously high quality, and they are finding audiences different than ever before. There was some stuff in here that didn't line up as much, and there's some things that aren't. Not everything is a certified absolute banger, but still, I think this was a decent video at reviewing the Capcom situation because it is an interesting story, and it's something that we've been deeply covering for like 10 to 15 years of making YouTube videos and everything. It's something we've deeply been covering.